Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it's my honor and privilege to inform you that our distinguished speaker is going to be Dr. Ahmad Karimi Hakkak. I don't want to waste any time. Therefore, I would like to ask Dr. Homa Mahmoudi, our clinical psychologist, wonderful and beautiful, to tell us about Dr. Hakkak. Dr. Mahmoudi.
Good afternoon, dear friends. It's really with great honor and pleasure that I would like to welcome all of you here and to thank the Mehregan Foundation, specifically Mr. Firouzi, the time witness, how he has worked night and day with a non-existing staff to put this wonderful conference together. And to thank Dr. Halakoui for always having wonderful ideas and implementing a great conference for all of us. And I think allowing every one of us to think about the concept of freedom as it applies to our lives and to the world at large. Today, I have the honor of introducing a great friend, a wonderful man that I have loved and honored for many years. Dr. Karimi Hakkak was born in Mashhad in 1944. And he went through elementary and secondary school in his hometown. He studied classics of Persian literature at an early age with his father. He received his bachelor's degree in English literature in 1966 from the University of Tehran. And then he came to the United States and studied public education administration at the University of Maryland for 2 years and returned to Iran to teach at the University of Tehran. It's interesting, this man has been teaching since he was 20 years old. He taught English at the Air Force Academy when he was just 20 years of age. Then he returned to the United States to continue his studies and received a Master's of Arts degree in English literature in 1974, and then 2 graduate degrees in comparative literature from Rutgers University, which is his MA and his PhD. In the early 1980s, Dr. Karimi Hakkak was a professor of comparative literature at Tehran University. But because of the revolution, he came to the United States, and in 1984, after a year-long lectureship at the University of Texas in Austin, he resumed his career at the University of Washington. He's now professor of Persian and Iranian literature, Iranian culture and civilization at the University of Washington in Seattle. I was looking at his resume. It's a book, first of all. He has written many pieces of literature. And when you listen to him and you read his work, you find how diverse his work has been. From Machu Picchu to Hawaii to French literature to Arabic to Tajikistan, it's all over the world. Professor Karimi Hakkak has taught comparative literature, literary theory, both in the United States and in Iran. He has won numerous awards and honors, and he's very humble. He hasn't even included half of them in his resume, including a Mellon Professorship at the University of Chicago in 1992 and a Social Science Research Council grant in 1994. He was elected twice, in 1998 and 2000, to chair the 2nd and 3rd conferences on Iranian studies. He is the author of 16 books and over 100 articles. In 1996, his monograph, Recasting Persian Poetry, won honorable mention by the prestigious Saidi Sirjani Book Award Committee. He's a regular contributor to Encyclopedia Britannica and the Encyclopedia Iranica, and has written the essay on the Persian tradition in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Translation Studies. His scholarly works have been translated into Persian, Arabic, and Japanese, as well as Russian, German, and French. In addition to regularly participating in North American-based scholarly organizations, such as the Middle Eastern Association, MESA, and the Society of Iranian Studies, he has presented papers at over 50 international conferences addressing various issues related to Persian literature and Middle Eastern literary traditions, particularly as these relates to the application of literary theory to the national literatures of the Middle East. He is married to Nasrin Khanum Aziz and is the father of Kusha and Kia. I want to tell you that recently he was invited to deliver the prestigious Ehsan Yarshater Literature Series at UCLA. He didn't even include this in his resume. It is a one-week program that only top scholars are invited to give this lectureship. Many of us had the honor of listening to his impeccably well-written and researched work. We were also aware that we were at the presence of an exceptionally unusual and wonderful human being, a self-effacing, talented man of great intellect and sensitivity. It is believed that the greatest form of freedom is freedom from self. And Dr. Karimi Hakak is this person who does not deal with the ego and the self in its negative interpretation of ego and the self, and does not allow the self to interfere with his judgment, thinking, and expression. It is with great pleasure that I'd like to present to you Dr. Ahmad Karimi Hakak.
Thank you. And thank you, Dr. Mahmoudi. When Dr. Halakoui said, a clinical psychologist is going to introduce me, my heart sank. Fortunately, she was very merciful. Thank you. I sincerely would like to thank you all for being here. And I think it's my duty, I'm duty-bound to thank all those people who have had anything to do with this gathering. It's a marvelous occasion. And I think I would not be demeaning its content in any way if I say it's a celebration as well. It's a celebration of a community coming to itself. And I think it's a tremendous occasion. Dr. Halakoui has for years, I've cherished his friendship for the past 33 years. But in recent years, I've heard indirectly, unfortunately, because we do not have the fortune of being able to listen to him over his radio programs. But I think he has been performing a superhuman service to this community, and I think it's wonderful to have him among us. And Mr. and Mrs. Firouzi, who have, for the past 3 months, been calling me repeatedly, asking me for various things and informing me of various aspects of this gathering, have been wonderful. But for their persistence, I'm sure some things may have been a little imperfect in this gathering. Fortunately, we've got a man and a woman who are perfectionists by themselves, and therefore they see to it and they saw to it that something of that perfectionism seeps through to this gathering. Mr. Shalchi, who called from the press asking for the spelling of some titles, I appreciate your precision, and thank you for it, Mr. Shalchi. My old friend, the great poet, Parto Nouri Allah, has been in contact on my part in this gathering. And Dr. Mahmoudi, of course, has been wonderful. I, too, cherish and honor her friendship, and my family and I are blessed by counting her among our friends. Speaking of my family, I was thinking, coming here, that I should finally do what I keep forgetting to do in the everyday routine of my life. And that's thank my wife, Nasreen, and my children, Kusha and Kia, who are here. Nasreen has been a marvelous partner in my life, and she has put up with me, my inattention, my goofiness, all kinds of things. Wonderful. My sons are fast emerging as my greatest critics. In fact, Kusha read a draft of what I'm going to present today and made some wonderful suggestions, mainly points of clarification. As someone who works with young people, among them young Iranian Americans, I think one of the greatest things we should be proud of and we can be proud of are the children we are bringing up. And I see it as if in a crystal ball that the generation of our children is going to make its mark in history as a marvel of cross-civilizational achievement. As you know, I've been given the opportunity, and I'm thankful for it, of giving two talks here. This one is in English. Tomorrow at 11:30 there will be one in Persian. The grand scheme and the main theme of the two talks are about the same, although my approach is going to be different. One of the peculiarities that those of us who speak, teach, read, and write in both languages come across is that you have to adopt various languages, various discourses. And I do not mean Persian versus English. There's a language of a scholarship in Persian and another language of a scholarship in English. And I think that's why I've never attempted to translate my own work into Persian, because I think it does not communicate anything except to those who already can read the English. I rather would advocate an approach where versions of our work are then presented according to the universe of discourse in a particular discipline that may be applicable in Iran as in the United States. But that's not my subject. In this talk, I'm going to go about this talk in a rather disciplined way by exposing to you first, opening up my theory and my hypothesis and my methodology, and then making the few points that I am here to make today. Tomorrow, of course, we'll have an opportunity to anchor the same talk in far more evidence in the Persian literature of the past 1,100 years, both the classical tradition and the contemporary one, and to drag out of this whole study perhaps a kernel of an idea that I have been toying with for many, many years, and that I have been criticized and attacked very vehemently for. Because people have sensed that in the back of whatever it is that I'm saying this glorious culture needs a very radical rethinking, a very radical reading. Parts of those radical readings have been offered by my colleagues, among whom Farzaneh and Abbas Milani, and I cherish their work for that. Part of it remains to be done, and when all of us are done, and when we leave this world, I think this kind of scholarship is going to reverberate back in Iran and change the attitude and bring about a generation of Iranians that would view their glorious, august literary culture in a very different way. Basically what I'm saying, and what I'm going to reiterate here today, is that we have fallen under the spell of Persian literature, that we submit to it and to its persuasive power all too uncritically, without asking the right questions and without acknowledging the alterity, the heterogeneity, the otherness of the people who have left that patrimony, that heritage to us. I believe we no longer live in the worlds of Rudaki and Firdausi and Hafiz. And much as, of course, we need to read them and honor them and treasure them, we need to realize that they were another. That our duty today dictates that we capture our own world, define our own world, and live in our own world, finally, once and forever, and look at Persian tradition, read it in the same way that a scientist looks at a cell under a microscope. I believe we have not done that. I believe all too often we come to Hafiz on our knees, already down. Why? Why do we do that? Why do we accept things like دستی از غیب برون آید و کاری بکند جهان و کار جهان جمله هیچ در هیچ است. Are these the things we live our lives by? And not only do we do that, we go around telling our friends that we actually do augury, open our fortune on the basis of Hafiz's divan. I never do that. I don't believe you do that. I don't believe you go out buying and selling stock on the basis of the poem that you opened on the page the evening before. Why we do that, it beats me. Some things become cliche. We keep repeating them and leave an image of ourselves in our host cultures that really does not jibe with reality. My basic point is going to be, we need to nurture more rational, critical thinking in our culture. The theory I'm going to base my talk today, brief as it has to be, is basically that there is such a thing as culture. And yet, culture too is a dynamic, ever-changing entity. Not only that culture has subspecies. And two of those subspecies are political culture and aesthetic culture. And once we approach these categories in this way, and once we read our literature, or offer a reading of our literature, or a rereading of our literature, that leads us to the aesthetic culture that is the basis for it, and once we transpose and transfer that energy from the aesthetic culture to the political culture, we will then come up with a kernel of some truth. We will begin to understand our political behavior. Politics is rooted in political culture, in other words, just as literature is rooted in aesthetic culture. Our behavior on the political scene cannot be imagined to be totally divorced and isolated from our behavior in the literary scene. After all, political culture is that system which gives us our way of behaving in politics. Whether we vote or not, whether we join political parties or not, whether we demonstrate for or against this particular state, whether we actively participate in political processes, whether we want, as we seem to have wanted all through the 20th century, a huge government to solve all of our problems, some say to kill all of our enemies, eradicate them, or whether we begin to behave otherwise, I submit to you today that there are pieces of knowledge that we can get from our beautiful literary tradition that are relevant to that behavior. That being my theory, I then say, well, we certainly have a lot to be proud of. And other speakers have touched on those too. And I can only detail them on that. But the fact is that, as they too have mentioned, for over 150 years, people have been trying to bring about political freedom, but have not been that successful. Of course, the political culture has changed just as the general culture has changed, in the same way that I do not behave the same way towards my wife, and I do not view her in the same light as my great-great-grandfather may have viewed his wife. In fact, sometimes I tell my students, go ahead, present 3 slices of Iranian society to me, 1900, 1950, 2000. A lot has changed. Not even an Ayatollah Khomeini, with that huge mandate of the revolution on his shoulders, could say, okay, women cannot vote. We have crossed that milestone. Not even with all the efforts of the early years of the revolution, where Iranian women cowed into becoming good mothers and good mothers only. So there's a lot of change. There's a lot of positive change. Why is it then that all this collective effort to bring about political freedom does not seem to have borne fruit? I submit to you that it is because, number one, we don't see the changes that have been brought about. And number two, because we in a way, preach one thing and practice another. We do not put our money or our feet where our mouth is. We express the desire to achieve political freedom, but we are not willing to pay the price. That is basically the theory I'm going to base my talk today. My hypothesis is that we have established institutions that are supposed or were supposed to bring about political freedom. We do have a parliament. We do have courts. We do have the separation of powers. Where has things gone wrong? Where have things gone wrong so that that institutionalization has not led to concrete steps towards achieving and expanding political freedoms, the political realm? And I submit to you, it is because every one of us like aspects of authoritarianism, that we enjoy exercising authority over our children, that as men, many of us enjoy exercising authority, what authority patriarchy makes available to us, over our women, that we do not really appreciate otherness. We pay lip service to religious diversity, we pay lip service to linguistic diversity, but what does it actually mean to say that Turkish Iranians and Persian Iranians are both Iranians of equal rights? Which one of us is willing to even say, even if Iran gets divided, it is more important for that Turkish-speaking Iranian to get his freedom? Of course, we'll try not to let that happen, because the integrity of a country is at stake, and we'll try to assure and ensure as many rights for them within if necessary, a federated system, whereby their linguistic and cultural otherness is fully acknowledged and celebrated. I know some of what I'm going to say is not going to sit well with some people, yet hear it from me. Now, finally, it is my assumption, of course, that in our glorious classical literature, while the ideal of freedom is there, it is not the kind of freedom we seek. That in this literature, as in our society today, and much more so in the past than today, we value stratification, we value hierarchy. We go through gestures of superiority and submission. We go through gestures of who is better than whom and why. And those things I submit to you are maybe old, outdated norms, social norms that we need to leave behind. Now, we do have things to celebrate. Look at you. Look at this gathering. The organizers of this conference have doubtless sensed the urgency of putting the issue of freedom, and not necessarily political freedom, but let's say spiritual freedom, mental freedom, freedom of worship, freedom of work, freedom of play on the agenda. So there's hope. There's a lot of hope. What we need to do is to keep doing this in a sustained way for a long period of time. Change in the social scene, in the social sphere, may not be as slow as geological change, but it certainly is not as fast as personal human changes on my face and yours. And as such, we need to learn to be patient and to persevere. In this, I'm going to take a page from the history of freedom in the West. We see this freedom, and of course American society is a kind of artificial society. It did not proceed from the very beginning. It left off where the British tradition of the 16th and 17th centuries had left off. And so we see in this Western, shall we say, tradition, the march of freedom that has gone on for centuries. And it is there because every generation contributes to it by resisting or by ascending, by giving consent or by denying consent to the rulers. I arrived in this country when the Vietnam War was going on, and I saw the undoing of Nixon, thank God. And I saw the March for Civil Liberties, that wonderful, beautiful movement these days we hear about because it's commemorating Martin Luther King in ways. And so I think we need to pause, give ourselves credit, and continue our march with vigilance, under the watchful eyes of our children's children, and encourage them to proceed. I think in a generation we're going to have a wonderful representation here in this country that views Iran not in terms of the rulers of the time, but in terms of the old country, transcending us and our political baggage for or against this or that state. States come and go. They are transient. Cultures are what we need to pay attention to. And I would like to submit to you that the whole course of Iranian modernization gives us real cause for pride, not hollow, boastful pride. But it tells us that in areas where we have been able to modernize more or less completely, it has taken the patience of generations to go through the modeling activity, to look around, to look at the Paris of the 1870s and 80s and 90s, to look at the French Revolution and see what kernel of idea can be transplanted into Iranian society of the time. That, after all, is what brought the culture of the constitutional movement to Iran. As a result, I would like to argue that appropriation and indigenization, that is, making things native and appropriating. Read Sayyid Fakhruddin Shadman's book, Taskhir Tamaddun Gharbi, or Taskhir Tamaddun Farhangi. It's a wonderful thesis. It says, we conquered this. We are so great that we did conquer these elements from the West. Once we start to change this mental pattern into what we indeed, not any single individual, but we as generation after generation of Iranians have done, that really becomes cause for our pride. I would like to argue with you that by the time that changed into the model of Gharb Zadegi, or being struck by the West, we went into a defeatist mode, which we still are, into a mode of withdrawal, into a mode of somehow running after some notion of purity in our own culture that never was there. It never was. Neither during the Sasanian, nor during the Islamic period, nor even definitely during the Safavid and on. But of course, there were periods when efforts, great efforts, were made. And I'm going to speak to you about that. So, given those strategies of presentation, my talk is going to be historical and comparatist. I'm going to make analogies with Western countries, Europe and the United States, and I'm going to move you through stages of history. Let me begin this way. The relations of power and authority, observable in Persian poetry and prose, both classical and contemporary, are not conducive to the nurturing of the notion of freedom as we understand it or ought to understand it. Nixon is going to China. Myself, a professional student of literature, is going to tell you something is wrong with our literature, except that I'm not going to invite you not to read it, because that would be the best way of submitting to it. I'm going to ask you to give yourself agency and make you determine what Hafiz means to you. Do not allow that man, because he's a devil in language. He can govern your minds so easily. Liberate yourself from the discourse of Persian literature, and then look at him and say, I accept this line and this image, and I do not accept this and that image. After all, that kind of dialogue has been going on in Persian literature for so many generations. When in a rubai attributed to Khayyam we hear, ای کاش پس از 1000 سال از دل خاک چون سبز امید بردمیدن بودی. And in a ghazal by Rumi we hear, کدام دانه فرو رفت در زمین که نرست چرا به دانه انسانت این گمان باشد. We are already observing a dialogue, a debate. The image of a seed planted in the soil and the likelihood or unlikelihood of its growth, or whether this is a good analogy for life after death, becomes the bone of contention. We have lost those bones of contention. We no longer question our classics as much as we should. We are proud of Firdousi, and of course it's wonderful to have him. He has given us so many of our myths. Without him we would not have had them. And yet we either read him wrong, and when Rostam Farrukhzad says something like Tofu bar toy charkh gardun tofu, we think he has said that, whereas he has not. Or we simply think that his kind of freedom is our kind of freedom, but it's not, for your information. In the whole tradition of the early Persian poetry, the tradition of the ghazal and the qasideh, the kind of dialogue that goes on between the poet and the patron is of no use to us, because it nurtures mutual flattery and mutual tutelage. The poet sings the praises of the patron, king or minister or prince or whoever, thereby assuring or working towards the assurance of his good name in history, and the patron rewards him materially, sometimes by filling his mouth with pearls. Is that how we want to relate to our authorities? I suspect not. Therefore, that tradition needs to be studied as closely as we can and then put in its own place. Just as we put the pottery of our ancestors of thousands of years ago in museums and look at them and marvel them, but we do not eat out of them, do we? We should stop allowing Persian poetry to dictate our patterns of thinking. That is my opinion. All right. Those relations are functions of the history that these men and women have lived. In the early Persian ghazal and qasideh, of course you see an outwardly wonderful, worldly, beautiful universe. Shadzi ba siyah chashman shad ke jahan neest juz fasane wa bad. It's a wonderful dictum, but it does not tell us about our rights as citizens, nor should it. Why should we have Rudaki speak our mind? We are not speaking the minds of people who come thousands of years after us, nor can anyone. We should stop expecting that. We should give ourselves agency, authority to read them and choose from them as carefully as we can. زمان پندی آزادوار داد مرا، زمان چون نگری سر به سر همه پند است. به روز نیک کسان گفت غم مخور زنهار، بسا کسا که به روز تو آرزومند است. Wonderful. Wonderful dictum. And yet, there may be things in them that we will not, should not accept. در کف شیر نر خونخواره‌ای غیر تسلیم و رضا کوچاره‌ای. Not only taslim, but reza as well. Look at our political culture. Shah Abbas has a boastful pride, calling himself Kalb Astan Ali, the dog of Ali's doorstep. The Qajar kings, one after another, leave testimonials to be buried not in the country they ruled, but at the foot of some imam in Iraq. And the late Shah of Iran spoke of Abu al-Fazl taking his hand, and when that was when Tawfiq said, Abu al-Fazl didn't even have hands. Thank you. Now, we can laugh at those, but is there anyone in this hall who at some point in December 1979, during Bakhtiyar's reign, took the likeness of Imam Ali in his or her hand and demonstrated in Amjadiyeh to oppose a religious revolution? That behavior is not modern. That behavior is as medieval as Inquisition, as wrong and as misguided as Shah Abbas boasts. Look at the whole tradition of manqabat. It's a kind of poetry in which you praise, eulogies of the Imams. علی همای رحمت تو چایتی خدا را که به ما سوا فکندی همه سایه هما را به جز از علی که دارد پسری ابوالعجایب که علم کند به عالم شهدای کربلا را به جز از علی که گوید به پسر که قاتل من چو اسیر توست اکنون به اسیر کن مدارا بروی گدای رحمت در خانه علی زن که نگین شهریاری دهد از کرم گدارا. It's good to have an idea of a perfect man, the perfect universal man. But what does that take away from us? Does it take away from us a full acknowledgement of the truth that our neighbor, who is of a different religion, has the right to exercise? If it does, fine. If not, has to be left aside. Now, this early poetry then becomes a tradition of mysticism. I have studied Persian mystical poetry long and hard. If there was a notion of azad and azadeh in a worldly, secular sense in the Khurasani school of poetry, by the time the discourse of mysticism takes over Persian poetry, all of that goes through a grand internal, what I have called, I'm on the record having done this, called grand internalization. That's the process by which Jam Jahannama becomes Dil Arif, the mystic's heart. That's the process by which the Simorgh of Shahnameh becomes the Simorgh of Mantiq al-Tayr. That's the process by which Shaitan becomes Iblis in Persian poetry. And that, I submit to you, is the process which elevates and foregrounds and privileges the notion of azadegi as an individual virtue having nothing to do with my neighbor, And آزادگی then comes to mean وارستگی. The poem that was read here and aptly, چند خواهی پیرهن از بهر تن رها کن تا نخواهی پیرهن, is a great example of that. Can we live by that? I do not wish to live by that. And bands are not just band سیم و زر. There are so many bands. When Hafiz says غلام همت آنم که زیر چرخ کبود ز هر چه رنگ تعلق پذیرد آزاد است, he's joking. He feels so many ta'alluqs. He belongs to that beautiful city of Shiraz. And he belongs to Persian poetry. Not only that, he elevates it. These ideas are otherworldly. They ought to be left there as museum pieces. Let's look at relations of power. In one ghazal by Rumi we read, نگفتمت مرو آنجا که آشنات منم، در این سراب فنا چشمه حیات منم، وگر ز خشم روی 100,000 سال ز من به عاقبت به من آیی که مبتدات منم. نگفتمت که به نقش جهان مشو راضی که نقش بند سراپرده رضات منم. نگفتمت که تو را ره زنند و سرد کنند که گم کنی که سر چشمه صفات منم. It goes on, chiding, scolding. But then comes the lesson. اگر چراغ دلی دان که راه خانه کجاست، وگر خدا صفتی دان که کد خدات منم. So when I descend this podium, you should all consider me your cat khuda and pay homage to me. Is that what we want to do? When Hafiz, who himself is not an Arif, but uses the language of Arif, reiterates the same thing in that beautiful ghazal. در سرای مغان رفته بود و آب زده، نشست پیر و سلای به شیخ و شاب زده، معاشران همه بر بندگیش بسته کمر، ولی ز ترک کله چتر بر صحاب زده، فروغ جام و قدح روی ماه پوشیده، ازار مغبچگان راه آفتاب زده، گرفته ساغر عشرت فرشته رحمت، ز قطره بر رخ حور و پری گلاب زده، ز شور و شعبده شاهدان شیرین کار، شکر شکست سمن ریخته رباب زده. سلام کردم و با من به روی خندان گفت که ای خمار کش مفلس شراب زده، که این کند که تو کردی ز ضعف همت و راه ز گنج خانه، ز ضعف همت و رای ز گنج خانه شده خیمه بر خراب زده. صلاح دولت بیدار ترسمت ندهند که خفته ای تو در آغوش بخت خواب زده. بیا به میکده حافظ که بر تو عرضه کنم 1000 صف ز دعاهای مستجاب زده. به می سجاده رنگین کن گرت پیر مغان گوید که سالک بی خبر نبود ز راه و رسم منزل ها. Pledge yourself. One reads in mystical literature about these elaborate initiation rites, about absolute loyalties, about blind allegiances, about uncritical followership, and about all kinds of unseemly behavior, or behavior that we today would think of as unseemly, if we were only to obtain and learn to cherish our full agency and individuality. I am the one who gives that literature meaning. That literature is not going to infect my mind. I am going to take from it what I want and look at it and define my distance from it in my own terms. I say this because I feel a tremendous admiration for Sufism. I think it had a real and very significant historical mission to accomplish, and it did accomplish that. At the time when orthodoxy, Islamic orthodoxy, was covering everyone in a blanket of conformity, there were people who said life has to be lived experientially. گر مرد رهی میان خون باید رفت، از پای فتاده سرنگون باید رفت، تو پای به راه در نه و هیچ مپرس خود راه، بگویدت که چون باید رفت. A literature of experience. It's gorgeous, it's beautiful. It has so much to offer us. But it cannot again become our operating principles. it also provided a wonderful personal way towards salvation for those of us who still need spirituality, who still need divinity, not just because they're thinking of afterlife, but because they want to live their lives morally and ethically. So I am not, please do not understand me as saying mysticism is bad or misguided. I'm just saying it's a historical phenomenon, and it has served its useful purpose. The mysticism of our time is look into my heart. When Coleridge, at the beginning of the 19th century, the British poet, wanted to express the same idea of the presence of something spiritual in the air, he made a poem. It's wonderful. And what if all of animated nature be but one organic harp diversely framed, through which blows an intellectual breeze at once, the soul of all and God of each? Same idea, but prefaced by, what if? In other words, and what do you say? It's inviting dialogue. Whereas the poetry of Iranian mysticism, Persian mysticism, Islamic mysticism is the poetry of you shut up and listen to, and I will tell you what it's all about. That's how it is. Hami gofto, Saadi says at the end of that wonderful poem, Shabi yad daram که چشمم نخفت شنیدم که پروانه باشم گفت که من عاشقم گر بسوزم رواست تو را گریه و سوز زاری چراست بگفت ای هوادار مسکین من برفت انگبین جان شیرین من شمع رو the candle is made out of when honey goes out of wax چو شیرینی از من به در می رود چو فرهادم آتش ز سر می رود تو بگریزی از پیش یک شعله خام من استادم تا بسوزم تمام تو را آتش عشق اگر پر بسوخت مرا بین که از پای تا سر بسوخت همی گفت و می رفت دودشت سر که این است پایان عشق ای پسر. Plato distinguishes between mythos and logos. Mythos has to do with the need for us to make myths, to make stories. Indeed, as I'm going to reiterate and emphasize tomorrow, our universe is not a universe of atoms and molecules. It's a universe of narratives and stories. And in that sense, man is a myth-making creature. The point is, as man moves more and more towards the field of science, intellect is nurtured more and more. And so in Plato, even Plato 2,500 years ago considered the two complementary. But of course, in every culture, at any given point in time, one of them is superior or is thought to be superior and dominates the other. And I suggest to you that for all our logocentricity as a culture, mythos has ruled over our minds for centuries. Mythos in Persian literature. And by logos here I mean intellect, the exercise of intellect. Mr. Moshiri made mention of rationalism. Several speakers did, as a matter of fact. And I cannot agree more. I think it's right on target. We need to nurture rationalism. Rational thinking, the exercise of intellect, analytical mind, those things that happened in Europe during the Renaissance. You know, it's interesting. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and in 1492, something very important happened in Persian culture. Jami, Abdurrahman Jami died. He's the last great medieval poet. And within a decade, Shiism became the religion of Iran, the official religion of Iran, thereby cutting Iran on the one hand from this large Islamic culture which had given us the beautiful poetry of mysticism and the whole philosophy of mysticism. And on the other hand, it's brought about one of the most reactionary interpretations of religion on record in history. You know, the rituals we used to call Omar Koshan started there. And so many other atrocities. Rational thinking, a la Greek, is going to be very important. Reason at various times has been contrasted to sense experience in rationalism, and human intellect has been judged at times as an absolute capable of discovering all the truths of the universe. We need not go that far to talk about our duty, our national obligation to nurture critical, rational thinking. Unfortunately, we still live, not those of us who have been thrown out of that whole machine, but many still live in a culture of rote memory, respect for the heritage. And it's interesting, the less people know that heritage, the more they seem to respect it, or at least stand in awe of it. There are gradations of rationalists, of course. John Locke was mentioned several times by Mr. Moshiri, and he's right again. He told us that materials of knowledge emanate from reason and from individual experience. All of this was made possible in the Renaissance. Scientists like Galileo, Copernicus, philosophers like Locke, Kepler, and Descartes, later Hegel and Hegelians all did this. Galileo has a statement that I would like to emphasize. He says, all of the world's truth is written in the great book of nature. It's only one step from here to Darwin, whether we agree with him or not. It's only one step also to Marx, because the truth of history is part of our nature too. And it's interesting because nobody has questioned the notion of the entity that Mr. Halakoui, Dr. Halakoui alluded to last night, and that's Al-Lawh al-Mahfuz, the book, the preserved tablet that's out there and it says on it what I'm going to say in a minute. The notion of Jabr and Ikhtiyar. And one of the great things about Rumi is that he goes right against Jabr, whereas Hafiz is a total Jabri. He is a fatalist. He believes in predeterminism. آنچه استاد ازل گفت بگو میگویم که بر من و تو در اختیار نگشوده است. Whereas Rumi says این که فردا این کنم یا آن کنم خود دلیل اختیار است ای سلام. Rational thinking of the kind that Rumi was nurturing. Reason got lost after the... It's well funny, our culture is a culture that has had its Middle Ages after its Renaissance. And then comes modernity. Wonderful human beings. Again, many of them were mentioned. Let me mention Kermani, for example. He tried to correct the path of poetry, of Persian poetry, by example. A generation later, Kasravi attempted the same thing. Unfortunately, he went a little too far, much too far. My dream is that someday poetry should find its own beautiful niche in our culture, rather than seeping through it all through and through. We should know where to place poetry and where to make use of it. We cannot live our political life through poetry. Any attempt in that direction is doomed to postponing the idea of freedom even more. So, there we have it. Rational, scientific thinking is what we ought to nurture. And men like Kermani, Akhundzadeh knew it. Men like Dehkhoda nurtured it. All of the constitutionalists who thought about politics, the point was absolutely right that was mentioned, that the parliament, the first few Iranian parliaments really dazzled the world. We are a talented people. Look at us standing that crossroads of the world for so many thousands of years. But our talent comes from our diversity. It's nonsense to say we are Aryans. That's racist. It comes from all this admixture. And unless we acknowledge that full diversity, or that diversity as fully as we can, we will not recapture the soul of Iran in its most beautiful. Look at people like Rafat, who sought to bring about literary aesthetic change by actually aping, shall we say, or imitating the modes of poetry written in the West. The sonnet, for example. Again, I've written about this and I'm on record arguing this. Lahuti tried to undermine this aesthetic system on which Persian poetry is based. من از امروز ز حسن تو بریدم سر و کار گو به دیوانگیم خلق نمایند اقرار. He's the one who moves from the imagery of the parts of the body, the beloved's, the cruel, unyielding beloved's tresses and the eyebrows and the lips and so on and so forth, into the image of a woman as a citizen, as Farzaneh was trying to recapture with her own people, the women that she mentioned. Nima's attempt to actually expand the metric and rhyme systems of Persian poetry to make room for modern expressions, to actually allow meaning to become, to have superiority over meter and rhyme. You know, in the height of the debate between old and new poetry, one statement stood out in my mind. I was a young man then, and that was, really classical poetry is written from left to right, because you first have to have all of your rhymes and then start filling in the blanks. At least Nima said, this is what I want to say. Now, Nima was not a very felicitous poet. His command of the Persian language was not great. But in the hands of the next generation, the path that he initiated reached its height immediately. You only need to look at the poets that succeeded Nima. Shamlu, Akhavan, Farrukhzad. Look at that. Qasedak, a beautiful little poem. Qasedak Han, چه خبر آوردی؟ از کجا و از که خبر آوردی؟ And it says, قاصد تجربه هایی همه تلخ با دلم میگوید که دروغی تو دروغ که فریبی تو فریب. Have you thought how beautifully he contrasts the qasid and the qasedak? He's writing this poem in 1335, let's say 1956 or 7, and he's recalling the fall of Mossadegh and all that, the excitement that the Mossadegh movement, the nationalist movement, started in Iran. And he says, قاصد تجربه های همه تلخ با دلم میگوید که, and to contrast the qasid and the qasedak. And when Shamlu, as a young poet, wanted to actually allow Persian poetry to modernize, modernist Persian poetry to find its place, he actually reversed and subverted Mehdi Hamidi Shirazi's poem beautifully. شنیدم که چون قوی زیبا بمیرد فریبنده زاد و فریبا بمیرد. شاملو says, من آن غول زیبایم که بر استوای زمین ایستادم. Think of قوی زیبا dying and غول زیبا rising at the equator. Those are the ways these men advanced their cause. And by the time we come to the generation, almost the same generation of Sepehri and Farrukhzad, they do a subversive act which has yet to be written about as much as it deserves. They hit on the idea that the generation of Zabih Behruz, Ali Dashti, Sadiq Hidayat did not accomplish their fight against religion because religion still has a place in the minds of Iranians. So they wanted to take one step, and they attempted to change the notion of religion to the notion of faith. خورشید مرده بود و هیچ کس نمیدانست که نام آن کبوتر غمگین که از قلب ها گریخته ایمان است. آهی صدای زندانی، آیا شکوه یأس تو از هیچ جای این شب منفور نقبی به سوی نور نخواهد زد؟ فرخزاد says. Or Sepehri, wonderful poet. And من مسلمانم. قبلم یک گل سرخ، جانمازم چشم مر. You know the poem. حجر الاسود من، black stone، روشنی باغچه است. So we come all the way and all this way in order to make this point. And this is going to be about my final point, although I have a number of pages to read and to address. Custom-made faith. That seems to be what these poets prescribe. And as I said, we need to release ourselves from bondage to mythos, the need to make myths. There are no perfect men. There are perfectly good men and women. So, Sultan Walad, the son of Rumi, compares the relationship between his father and Shams to the relationship between Moses and Khizr. And you know, both in the Quran and in his narrative, Khizr is this very shadowy figure who wants to educate Musa and takes Moses along with him, and he says, I'm going to do things that you're going to be dumbfounded, but you cannot ask any questions. You see, it's the sheikh, the guiding sheikh, and the novice Sufi. And then he kills a baby. And then he does all kinds of things. And then when it comes to the killing of the baby, Moses can't help. He said, you just killed a human being. And he says, look through these fingers. And shows him that in 25 years that boy would have been a dreadful murderer. That's relegating all of these things to the realm of the master. No wonder people still look for charismatic leaders. We need to stop that search. We need to start incrementally gaining territories of freedom, one after painful one. And I would like to end by simply saying that this junction I recommend will express itself most obviously in a kind of decrease, possibly, in suffering. Wonderful as it is to have immediate contact with these great texts of the past, the price we have paid for uncritically reading them and submitting to their persuasive power has been insufferably high. We may not notice it because it expresses itself very indirectly in hidden ways. This high price is expressed in indirect ways, but it is there for so many eyes to see, in the number of victims of repression and violence in our culture, in the seemingly intractable structures of an immensely stratified society with huge, rigid hierarchical orders, in what is fast approaching an epidemic of depression and low expectations, of unethical behavior, rampant corruption, and most alarmingly in those modern day, specifically modern day versions of slavery, poverty, prostitution, addiction. The disjunction I recommend will express itself most obviously, if not immediately, in a kind of longing for freedom that transcends political revolutions or changes in the state. Political revolutions are not going to solve the problem of freedom in Iran. Internal, individual revolutions, changes that every one of us wants in his own, her own mind are. Freedom to develop to one's fullest potential, freedom to attain fulfillment of one's fullest individuality, freedom of worship, work, play. These may be legislated ad nauseum, discussed and pontificated, even made long lists of, but they amount to little if they are not internalized. And yes, even the glorious heritage of Persian literature can be recast and reinterpreted in accordance with our needs and aspirations, if only we begin to view it as our patrimony, legacy, and tradition, rather than something like unchangeable sacred texts. It's nonsense to place, even if you are a good Muslim, to place the Divan of Hafiz next to the Quran. All this, you see why I'm being attacked so vehemently in so many quarters. All this is possible, finally, if we begin to read and process our history, our literature, indeed our whole culture, political, aesthetic, and otherwise, critically, questioningly, and on the basis of our modern individuality, fullest individuality. Thank you.
Dr. Hakak, did you see your enemies? Thank you very much for your wonderful talk, eye-opener, and hopefully that your wake-up call is going to help us to talk to each other and think about it more deeply. Please be around at 4 o'clock. We are going to start another wonderful program with Dr. Ali Reza Akbari. Sorry for that misspelling or whatever. Thank you very much for coming. The doors are going to be open, so we are going to have the entire conference room. Thank you.